I'm Mike Bowler. In the Kanban guide, the first core practice is to define and visualize your workflow. And the guide gives us some good guidance on how we might want to do that definition. It gives us a number of specific points that we need to capture, and those are up here in the top of the screen, the top right. These are the things that must be included in our definition of workflow. But what the guide doesn't give us is any guidance on how we might want to approach this with a team. So how would we want to sit a team down and get them to define all of their workflow on its own? Well, I do have a standard way of doing things, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how I get a team to define their workflow. So we're going to start off with a board that looks like this. In this case, the board happens to be in Miro, which is my tool of choice, but it could be on any one of a variety of tools. It could be on a physical whiteboard if we're all in person. It could be on an electronic tool of some kind. But the point is we're starting with some kind of a shared visual collaboration tool. The first step is to identify the items of the units of value that flow through the team. That's our first bullet point up at the top right here, a definition of the individual units of value. For a typical team that's doing software development, those units of value might be things like a new feature request, or a bug, or a production support incident. Those are very common for teams that are doing new product development. If we're doing different things, I've worked with teams that were physically wiring up servers, or that were working on telephony systems. And for them, the type of work that flows through their team might be different. I worked with one team a couple of years ago. When we modeled out all of the different work that came through their team, we found over 90 different and distinct things that their team was requested to do. Although they generally followed common patterns, there were that many different and distinct things. And so we modeled them all out to see what was going on. So the first step, as I'm trying to model out the workflow, is I ask what types of work flow through your team. And so in this case, the team might say, well, we do new feature development. So we might get a new feature request. And I'm just going to write it down here. And I'll ask, is there anything else? Well, right up front, they might say, well, we also do bugs. And that might be enough to get us started, or they might decide that they want to flesh them all out now. Either way is fine. We need at least one in order to stay focused. So the next step is we want to start looking at some of the states. So I'm going to take this new feature request and I'm going to move it down onto the board here. And I want everybody to stay very focused. As we're talking through the workflow, we're talking very specifically about this one type of work. I notice that a lot of teams tend to get distracted, and at one point they're talking about new feature work, and at another point they're talking about bugs, and at another point they're talking about different things. As we're walking through this one step at a time, we want to be very focused on one particular work item type. So right now, all we care about is new feature requests. So then we're going to lay out all of these states here. And a tip that I learned, I can't remember who I learned this from, but I learned a long time ago, is that if we go backwards through the workflow, it's actually easier than going forwards. So I'm going to start at the end here by creating an item that is done. That is our last state, by definition. When we've hit done, there's no more work to be done. And so then I will ask the team, what was the last step before done? What was that last thing that you did before we said the work was done? And it might be that we sent an email to somebody. It might be that we closed a ticket in a ticketing system. It might be that we notified somebody by email or by phone call. There's going to be something that is at the end to say we have completed this piece of work. It is all the way at its final state. So in this case, let's imagine that we are going to send an email off to somebody. So if the team says that's what we're doing, we're going to send an email, that's great. So what happened right before that email? Well, we probably did some level of post-deploy verification. And so I'll ask the team, what did that look like? Oh, okay, so we did some kind of verification. Make that a little bit bigger so it's readable. We did some verification after deploy. Okay, so what happened immediately before that? And they might say, well, we actually deployed. So we deployed to production. Great. Now note that in this particular example, I've gone all the way to production, but for your team that might not be true. It might be that you're done when you get to some internal server. So we have to decide what is the correct workflow for your team in this situation. In the particular case I'm thinking of, production was the final answer. So then, right before deploy to production, what happened? Well, maybe we needed a sign-off. Maybe there was some level of a governance sign-off here. So I create a state for governance sign-off of some kind. Well, what happened immediately before that? Well, maybe immediately before that we had some kind of a UAT sign-off. All right, so what happened immediately before that? And again, this is not me making it up. As I'm facilitating the exercise, I'm asking the team, what happened immediately before this? Well, we actually did some level of UAT testing before the sign-off. Great. And what happened immediately before that testing? Well, we probably deployed to UAT. So let's put that down here. Okay, so what happened immediately before UAT deploying? Well, perhaps we did some kind of a code review. That's a fairly common thing. What happened before the code review? Well, possibly it was merged to a specific spot. So maybe we did, we committed and merged the code. Well, what happened before that? Likely what happened before that was we just did development. And what happened before that? Perhaps the work was just ready. So ready can be our last state. So at this point, once we've done one pass through, I'll ask the team, is there anything we've missed? Because quite often we have, as we've gone through it, people will call out and say, oh, now I've remembered about this piece or about that piece. So we're just trying to get all of the possible states as they go through. The fact that we've called them all out doesn't necessarily mean that each one is going to be a column on a Kanban board. It might be that they become exit criteria or entry criteria or just something that we have to remember not to do or not. So right now we're just trying to get an idea all the way across. This is the general flow for a new feature request. So once the team is happy with this, then we start to look, are all of these things states? It might be that we decide that the email sent really happens as part of verification. So it might be that email sent is not a separate state on its own, it's just sort of an exit criteria for verification. When we're finished verification, we send that email. So maybe we can put those two together. And we can just say that that email sent is going to be some kind of an exit criteria. So let's color code that differently. So you'll notice that I have down the left here, I have a bunch of different color codes for different things. So I might say that this email sent is going to be color coded as an exit criteria. It doesn't matter what the colors are, these just happen to be the color scheme that I'm using now. They have no predefined meanings, it's whatever is right for you. So then we might say, well, deploy to prod is sort of a prerequisite for verification, but it might also be a separate thing all on its own. Because often when we go to production, we don't control that ourselves, we have to request that somebody else do it. So often that one will be in a column all by itself. Well, then we've got governance sign-off and UAT sign-off, and they're probably separate and distinct things on their own. They're probably being done by different people, and it likely makes sense to keep them in separate columns. Well, what about UAT testing and UAT sign-off? It's possible that this sign-off is really just an exit criteria from UAT testing, that we can't say we've completed the testing until we got the sign-off. So if that were true, then we could just move that under here, and we could again change this so that this is just exit criteria and not a column on its own. We might go further and say the deploy, maybe the deploy to UAT is within our control. We don't have to ask anybody else to do it, and so it really just becomes entry criteria to UAT testing. So if I change the color to that to indicate that it is some kind of entry criteria, we still have a single column here, which is UAT testing, but in order to enter the column, we must have deployed, and in order to exit the column, we have to have signed off. Then over here, we've got code review and committed and merged code, and again, we might decide that one is a prerequisite for the other. We might say that committed and merged code is either an entry criteria for code review or it's an exit criteria from development. In my mind, I'm thinking it's an exit criteria, but again, whatever is right for your team. So now as we look across the board, we've got all of these different things that need to get done at every different stage, but not all of them are going to turn into columns. We currently have, what is it, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 columns across. Perhaps we could reduce them even more. Perhaps they need to expand. But as a starting point, this is a reasonable place. So once we've gone through and we've labeled all of these, we've got our exit and our entry criteria, which, by the way, map to the defined states up in the top right, and also the explicit policies. So that the states are our green cards going across. They're going to be turned into different columns. And our explicit policies are entry and exit criteria for each of the individual columns. We may have more policies that go along with that, but this is a good first step towards policies. So then we look at these. We now need to also define how we're going to control WIP across this model. It might be that we decide, as is very common, that we're going to have separate WIP limits on each column. This is by no means required. We could say that we're going to have a single WIP limit across the entire board. We could say that we're going to split WIP up across different columns, but it's very common to say we're going to have a separate WIP limit per column, and so that's what I'm going to do right here. So I might imagine that development is going to have a WIP limit of 6. And I'll make that a little bit bigger so that it's more readable. So we might say that 6 things could go there, and we'll put WIP limits on each of the other columns as well. Now, how would you define what those numbers are initially? I have a separate video on that one, and I would encourage you to go and watch that as well. I will link to that in the notes that go with this video. So where those numbers come from, I do have some good heuristics for how you would determine that. If you really don't know, you'll just have to guess. But we do need some initial WIP limits to get started, and we're going to need them on every column except done. Done, of course, is completed, and it's an infinite list, so you won't need a WIP limit on that. But you will need a WIP limit on everything in between your started and your end points, which we haven't talked about yet. So where is started and where is end on this board? We might say that end is just before we enter done. So we might move that line over and say we stop the clock just as we enter the done column, which is a very reasonable place to do it. We might say that we start the clock just before the ready column, or we might say that we start the clock right after the ready column. Either one is okay. They're measuring slightly different things. Doing it after is indicating how long the team is actually taking to get the work done. Doing it before ready is also including some of that customer wait time. And so that's also a good thing. Whatever is right for your team is what you should decide. I tend to put the start point to the left of ready, but it's not wrong to put it on the right of ready, whatever is the correct answer for your team. So now we've defined some states, we've defined how WIP is being controlled, we're putting in some explicit policies about all of this. The last step we have to do on this particular board is to get an initial SLE, or a service level expectation. And so I'm going to put down a service level expectation, imagining for the moment that we're just entering new work, we've never done this before. I might say, well, perhaps I think that 85% of our work will be done in 2 days. 2 days or less. Now, if I do have actual data, I want to go and calculate it from our real data. If I don't have real data, I have to make up a number. But we do want to have an SLE, and we will be adjusting this SLE over time. This is a key piece. So we've now gone through all of the steps that were up in the top right. We've got an individual unit of work, which is the new feature request. We've defined when started and end are. We've defined the states. We've defined how WIP is controlled. We've defined some explicit policies, and we've done service level expectations. And that's good for one work item type. Now, what other kinds of work does this team do? So we'll go back and we'll look at the remainder things. Now, in this case, the team has also called out that they do bugs. So if a bug comes in, the first question I'll ask is, does it match an existing workflow that we've already got on the board? In this case, we only have one workflow. But as it happens, bugs do match that. We follow the same workflow for bugs as we do for new feature requests. So I'll just move this down and say, now we have 2 different work items, or work item types, that follow the same workflow. And that's a good and positive thing. Now, the team might also say, well, you know, we have other types of work. Sometimes we get research requests where we're asked to go and investigate something and look into something and figure out what's going on. And so if we do that kind of work, it does not match this workflow. It doesn't have development and code review and UAT testing. Now, after we've done the research, somebody might decide to do a code change, but it doesn't typically match this workflow. So then we'll take this item and we'll move it down and we'll start the exercise all over again. So now we'll start to lay out all of our states, we'll figure out if they're entry or exit criteria. We'll do the same thing all the way through for this work item type. Then we'll come back and we'll say, well, are there more work item types? Is there anything else that we need to track? And we'll keep doing this until we've gone through all of the different work item types. Now there is one last policy that hopefully we don't have to deal with, but many teams do, and that's where we get into classes of service. Classes of service have their own problems. They introduce complexity into the system. They make it often more difficult to get stuff done, so it slows down the system as a whole. And I have a separate article in Improving Flow talking all about the pros and cons of classes of service and when you would want to do them and when you wouldn't. But the point for this video is that if you are required to do a class of service for expedited work or date-driven work or something like that, this is now the time where we would define that. So I would take another card and I would say, well, perhaps I have expedited work. And expedite follows these rules. Maybe we'll allow the WIP limit to go up by 1, perhaps we'll give higher priority to the work, perhaps we'll do whatever it is we do. Now's the time to define that, because we're defining that as part of our policies that go along with these boards. And we might decide that that class of service only applies to one of the boards or one of the work item types, or it might apply to all of them, but in any case we're going to document that and write them down. So again, just to recap sort of from the top, I start off with identifying the work item types. I lay them all out on the board. I group them a little bit to try and figure out what's going on. I put start and end times on things. I document my policies as clearly as I can, including both classes of service and not. WIP limits all go into the policies as well. I define a service level expectation, and we put that down on the board. And then we've got everything all laid out on the board. We keep repeating that until we've gone through all of our different work item types. And then at the end of this exercise, we will have fully defined what our system looks like. Now we can take this and translate it into whatever tooling we might have. So if we're using a tool like Jira or Rally, then we can go and enter the workflow into those tools, setting up appropriate WIP limits, setting up columns, setting up all of those things. Or if we're doing things on a physical board, we can go and translate it there. This is just a working space. This is not intended to be your final board. We now have to translate it into something somewhere else. If you found this interesting, we do cover all of this and more on our Applying Professional Kanban class, and so we get into even more depth on that, so you can always join us there.